Welcome to our discussion on principles of economics. And as you know, we are discussing about macroeconomic principles, right? In today's discussion, we will be talking about an important topic in macroeconomic principles called cost of living. This is very important. Why this is so? Why cost of living? Because when we earn money, it is not all about how much money in nominal sense we are earning. It also important to know how much we can buy with that money, right? So that's why cost of living is very important. When the price level goes higher, then with the same amount of money our purchasing power will go down. We will be able to buy less amount of goods and services. That is why when we talk to our parents, they usually say that they used to have their monthly income is 5, 10, or 15,000 rupees. But with that much money itself, they were able to maintain and run the family smoothly. Now, the 15,000 or 10,000 income monthly in, let's say, 1980s or 1990s is now become in equivalent to 1 lakh of income probably per month, because cost of living has gone up much higher. So cost of living means what is the cost of food items, what is the cost of pricing, what is the cost of medicine, so on and so forth. So combining all these, we will be constructing one general price index to know what is the cost of living, right? In that sense, it is important to know. Now, to understand cost of living, we will be discussing firstly an important concept called the consumer price index. This consumer price index actually measures the consumer's cost of living. And since it is a index, price index means we will be taking different commodities and their prices to construct such index. So the basis of cost of living adjustment in many contracts in the social security. In our country, when we are employed in formal sectors, then based on this consumer price index, governments give dearness allowances. So they increase your salary or they increase your many social protection scheme based on what is the cost of living decided by consumer price index. So now let us try to understand how this consumer price index is calculated. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics in an economy, they surveys consumers to determine the consumer's typical shopping basket. Typical shopping basket means on a day-to-day basis what we are consuming. Okay, now if I ask you in our day-to-day life what you are consuming, maybe you might be consuming some amount of rice, some amount of oil, some amount of dal, some amount of clothing, some medicine, so on and so forth. Okay, so that is called a representative or typical consumer. We are not surveying the consumer who are at the upper end of the income quantile or lower end of the quantile, but as a typical or representative consumer, what they are buying on their day-to-day life. Then we need to find the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They will find the prices of all the goods that belong to that particular basket. So first they will select the basket depending on what they are buying on their day-to-day life, and then they will find out the price of each of these items in that basket. And then at the third step, they will compute the cost of that basket. Okay, cost of that basket. If a consumer wants to buy that basket, how much money the consumer needs to spend. So we choose a base year and consuming and the compute the index, right? So that means in a particular year, if we want to calculate the CPI in any particular year, that means the same basket, let's say now this is 2023, let us say that we have assumed the base year as 2005. So that means what was the cost of that basket in the 2005 and what is the cost of the same basket in 2023? We will take a ratio of that, we will multiply that by 100 and then we will get consumer price index. And then using that consumer price index, we can easily calculate the inflation rate. You recall that in our earlier discussion, we introduced this inflation. We said that when government prints too much of money, that leads to inflation. What does inflation mean? We said that inflation is nothing but a sustained rise in consumer price index. So first we need to construct then consumer price index, and then we need to see how the consumer price index is growing. So a growth in consumer price index is basically the inflation rate. How do you calculate growth in consumer price index? CPR this year minus CPR last year divided by CPR last year multiplied by 100, and that is how we calculate inflation rate. So that means please keep in mind when you say that inflation is 5%, inflation is 6%, that means compared to the base year, consumer price index has gone up by 5%. That is the meaning. So inflation is always calculated as a rate compared to the base year. What is the growth in consumer price index? That means growth in the price of that basket, what we were talking about earlier. Higher the inflation rate, higher would be the cost of living. Now going back, why my father was able to maintain the same family with 15,000 rupees in 1980s and I am now maintaining almost similar kind of life standard with 1 lakh rupee, it is because of this inflation. Okay, so the cost of living has gone up. That means the cost of buying the basket, the typical basket, has gone up. That is the meaning of inflation. So we can take an example. Let's say in the typical basket, there are two commodities, pizzas and lattes, and a typical consumer, they can buy 4 pizzas and 10 lattes. You can substitute this pizza and lattes with idli and dosas because these examples are taken from the foreign countries, most of them from the US. That is their typical food habit. That is why pizza and lattes. We can have idli and dosas, no problem at all. The idea is same. Now we are taken here. We have taken 3 years, 2007, 8, and 9, and look at the price of pizza. It was 10, 11, and 12 respectively in 2007, 8, and 9, and then price of latte also $2, $2.5, and $3. So that means there is an upward rise in the prices of these two items, right? Now, if you calculate the cost of the basket, what is the cost of basket? That is $60 in 2007, then $69 in 2008, and $78 in 2009. So cost of the same basket 60, 69, and 78. Now if I want to calculate the inflation rate for 2008, what should I do? 69 minus 60 divided by 60 into 100. Look at this. So in 2007 it should be 100, right? And look at this, in 2008 it is 69 divided by 60 into 100, that means 115. So what is the inflation then? 15%, and it is 130%. So that means inflation rate, look at this, 15% in 2008 and then 13% in 2009. Okay, so 130 minus 115 divided by 115. That is the inflation rate. So this is how basically you need to calculate the inflation rate for each year. And look at what we are doing here. We are dividing each year's basket by 60. That means we are converting each year's price in the base year, which is 2007. So that is how inflation is calculated. Base year is very important here. Without knowing the base year, we cannot calculate. Okay. So another basket, 10 pounds of beef and 20 pounds of chicken, and these are the prices given. You can easily compute the consumer price index in 2005, then what was the inflation rate in 2005 to 6, and what is the CPI for 2005? It is very easy. Okay, so look at this, 10 into 5 and 5 into 20, so 150 is the consumer price index in 2005. And then how do you compute the inflation rate? Very simple. So 150 divided by 120 multiplied by 100. Why 120? Because 120 is the price in the base year 2004. Okay, very simple. And again 2005-6 if you take, then the CPI of 2006 is 210. Again 210 divided by 120 multiplied by 100 is 175. So CPI inflation rate is 40%. Okay. Now look at, there are different items we have taken. Generally, you can also calculate this by taking the data. So look at, mostly 43% of the spending is on housing. Actually, housing takes a lot of your money, and then next is 17% is transportation, and then 15% is food and beverage, medical care, and then recreation, education and communication, apparel, and others. So this is what is a typical basket, contains this type of items: housing, transportation, food, medical care, recreation, education, and others. Okay. Now substitution bias. See, CPI in 2004 consists of 10 number of beefs and 20 number of chicken, and household bought the CPI basket is this. Now in 2006 we see that 5 beefs and 25 chicken. So that means what is happening in CPI calculation, generally we first fix the basket and we calculate CPI with respect to the same basket. But over a period of time, consumers, what do? They basically substitute the costlier items with the cheaper items. So if beef is costlier than chicken, so probably what happened to 2006? See, look at consumers, they are buying only 5 pounds of beef and 25 pounds of chicken. So that means if we construct the consumer price index with the same basket, then what will happen? There would be an upward bias in that estimation. So if you compute the increase in cost of household basket over 2005-6 and compare CPI inflation rate, then this is how. See, 9 into 5 plus 6 into 25, so 195, right? But if you compute the inflation rate, that is 30%. But CPI inflation rate from previous problem, that means if you take the 2004 as the base year, then it would be 40%. That is why I said that if you fix the basket and always try to estimate the inflation rate based on the base year's basket, then there would be an overestimation of the inflation. That is the problem of this CPI approach, fixing the basket and calculating CPI inflation rate, that is the standard problem. So problem of CPI is substitution bias. Over time, some prices rise faster than others. But we don't consider that substitution. Consumers substitute towards good that become relatively cheaper. Okay, but the CPI misses this substitution because it uses a fixed basket. Thus, CPI sometimes overestimate the cost of living. That is what I am saying. The another problem is introduction of new goods. The introduction of new goods increases variety, allows the consumers to find products that more closely meet their needs. In effect, dollars becomes more valuable. So that means cost of living, as I said, it is also related to how much value is there for $1 or 1 rupee. So suppose earlier with 10 rupee I was able to buy only one variety of rice. Now with the new varieties of rice introduced, I am able to buy the rice which is more tastier, which is closely related to my taste. So that means in that sense also $10 or 10 rupee has become more valuable with the introduction of new products. Okay, so that also CPI misses this effect because it uses the fixed basket. Right, that is another problem of CPI. The CPI overestimate the increase in the cost of living. Okay, two reasons. Firstly, substitution bias, it is not able to capture. Secondly, the introduction of new goods. Then something called unmeasured quality change. So improvements in the quality of goods in the basket, as I said, it increases the every value of each dollar we spend. But how will you measure the quality? So the Bureau of Labor Statistics tries to account for the quality changes but probably misses some, as quality is very difficult, as you know, to measure. Okay, with 10 rupees earlier I was buying the quality of rice that was, let's say, much poor quality of rice than what I am buying right now. So that means my 10 rupee has become more valuable. With this, probably now I am able to eat basmati rice, which earlier it was not possible because basmati was not available earlier. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they make some attempt to adjust the quality, but quality is very difficult to measure. So you can fix the basket, but you cannot measure. In the basket there is always an item called rice. But rice also has different variety. Over a period of time, quality is changing. That's why money becomes more valuable. But CPI is not able to accurately capture and measure the value of the product. So CPI then overestimate the increase in the cost of living. These are the problems. So each of these problems causes CPI to overstate the cost of living increases, and Bureau of Labor Statistics has made some technical adjustment, but CPI probably still overstate the inflation by about some 0.5% every year. They made some adjustment, but still there is some kind of overestimation problem of this much amount. So this is important because the social security payment and many contracts have cost of living tied up with CPI. Now here in this diagram we will see the two measures of inflation between 1950 and 2007. This is CPI, and then another one is called GDP deflator, which we learned earlier. GDP deflator means that real nominal and real GDP, that ratio. When we talked about measuring nation's income and GDP, we said what is GDP deflator? GDP deflator is basically a ratio of nominal and real GDP, And if you calculate the growth in that deflator, that will also give you some measurement of inflation. Okay, so two price index we can use to construct inflation. One is the CPI, fixing a basket, finding out the cost of that basket, and then what is the growth in CPI. Another way of measuring this is by GDP deflator. GDP deflator is basically a ratio of nominal and real GDP, and that ratio is the GDP deflator, and growth in GDP deflator is basically another measure of inflation. Now look at this. So there is always some kind of mostly there is a parity between these two inflation, but in some areas either CPI is overestimating the GDP or GDP is overestimating the cost of living index given by CPI. So if you compare the CPI and GDP deflator as a measure of inflation, then imported consumer goods, they are imported in CPI because CPI first fixes the typical basket. It doesn't matter whether the basket contains a good which is imported or domestically produced. So that's why imported goods are included in CPI, but GDP does not include the imported good, because what I said, we discussed earlier, GDP is the measure of total goods and services produced within the domestic territory in a particular point of time. So that's why if some goods are included in that basket which are imported, those are not included in the GDP deflator. So if you measure inflation by GDP deflator, you are going to miss these items. Then capital goods. In the typical basket, what I said, that there is clothing, there is housing, transportation, this and that. But no capital expenditure. That means capital goods, heavy investment, machinery, plant and machinery, land, those things are not included in CPI, but GDP deflator, they use if those machines, those capitals, plant and machineries are produced domestically. Then CPI, it uses fixed basket, but GDP deflator use what I said, the currently produced goods and services. So that means the basket is not fixed. Okay. So since the basket is not fixed, the problem of CPI, that CPI is overestimating the cost of living because consumers, they are substituting cheaper goods, they are bringing cheaper goods and keeping the costlier goods away. Consumer will buy cheaper goods, so there would be a substitution bias. New varieties, new qualities of goods are also included over a period of time. CPI does not capture that. But if you go by GDP deflator, you can solve that problem, because GDP deflator uses all the currently produced goods and services. So that is the contrasting views of CPI vis-a-vis GDP. Both have some merits and demerits. So in each scenario, what we should do, determine the effects of CPI and GDP deflator, and then in these examples, actually in each of these following scenarios, so we need to construct or determine the effects on the CPI and GDP deflator. First one is Starbucks raises the price of Frappuccinos. Okay, whether CPI will be changed, whether GDP will be changed, GDP deflator, or both of them. Caterpillar raises the price of the industrial tractors it manufactures in Illinois factory. And then Armani raises the price of Italian jeans it sells in the US. Okay, so in each of this you have to think whether CPI will be affected or GDP deflator will be affected. So the CPI and GDP deflator both will rise in when the Starbucks raises the price of Frappuccinos. Why? Because GDP includes currently produced goods and services, and it is there, since it is not capital good, it is there in the consumer price index also. If the typical consumer, it is coming under that beverage what we discussed earlier. So both will rise. Okay, since this good is included in both GDP and CPI, it is included in both the cases, GDP and CPI both will increase. But what will be happening to the second case? Caterpillar raises the price of industrial tractors. Now this is a capital good which is not included in consumer price index, but it is included in GDP deflator. As a result of which GDP deflator will rise, but consumer price index will not. Okay. Armani raises the price of Italian jeans. So that means Italian jeans an imported product. Look at this. CPI will rise, but GDP deflator does not, because GDP does not include the goods which are imported. That is the reason. So correcting variables for inflation, then comparing dollar figures from different times. So inflation actually makes it harder to compare dollar amounts from different times. So I don't know whether 1 rupee in 2023 is not comparable with the same 1 rupee in 2020, because there is inflation. So the minimum wage, $1.15 in December 1964, has become $5.85 in 2007 because of this cost of living. Okay, so did minimum wage have more purchasing power in 1964 or 2007? So now we have data on two minimum wages. One is 1964, another one is 2007. Now can you tell me which one is having the minimum wage in 2007 and 64? Which one is having more purchasing power? So to compare the minimum purchasing power of these two minimum wages, I must know then cost of living. Without knowing the cost of living, I cannot actually compare these two values. So to compare, we need to use CPI, and we need to compare. How will you compare? That means this $5.85 in 2007 should be converted in 1964's figure. Then only it is comparable. Now look at this. How will you compare price level today and price level in that particular year multiplied by amount in year T dollars? So how will you do it? In our example, year T equals to 12 in 1964, and today it is 12 by 2007. Okay. So minimum wage is 1.5 in 2007 to 1964. So CPI in year T is, let's say, 31.3, and CPI today is 211.7. So then what you should do, you use this formula. Look at this. What we are doing, just we are taking the ratio of today's CPI and that base year's CPI, and then you multiply with the amount that we are trying to convert. That means you are getting 7.78. So 1.15 $1 in 1964 is equivalent to $7.78 today. But what we are getting? We are getting only 5.15. That is why it is so. Look at this. So this is 1.15 should be minimum wage should be then $7.78. But what we were getting, if you go back, 5.85 only. So minimum wage, that means, has not gone up to maintain a parity with the cost of living. That is what we are saying. Okay. So minimum wage then in 1964 was $7.78. That is what that means. This 1.15 we could have compared in today's dollar, it was 7.78. So it should have been $7.78. So the researchers, business analysts and policymakers often use this technique to convert a time series of current dollar figures into constant dollar figures. So they can see how a variable has changed over time after correcting for inflation. So that means $1.15 I need to convert in today's money. Then only I will be able to see whether I am better off after considering inflation. So minimum wage in January 1950 to 2007. Okay, this is an example. Look at this. This is the current dollar. Okay, and this is 2007 dollar. Okay, this is how we can compare the minimum wage in current dollar and today's dollar in the US. Is this clear? So current vis-a-vis the 2007, if we assume that in 2007 is the base year. And then annual tuition and fees average of all public four-year college and universities in the US, these are all converted into today's dollar. Okay, 1986-87 it was $1,414, and 1986 it is 109.6. Okay, so 2006 CPI is 213.8, and then you can again convert this. After adjusting for inflation, did students pay more college fee in 1986 compared to 2006? Okay, so tuition fee was $1,414 in 1986-87. Now it is 5,000 this. So that means I need to convert that 1,414 into today's price. How will you do that? Same technique again. 2003.8 divided by 109, and then you multiply with that year's money, you will get this. Look at this. We are taking a ratio of this and multiply with this, and then we are saying that in today's money, $1,414 would have been 2,629. But what we are paying? Much more than that. 5,834. So that means in real sense also, after adjusting for inflation also, that means we are paying more. On an average, annual tuition fees has gone up in 2006. So even after correcting for inflation, tuition and fees were much lower in 1986 compared to 2006. So the nominal values are not directly comparable. We need to convert today's money into that period's money what we are talking about. Okay. So a dollar amount is indexed for inflation if it is automatically corrected for inflation by law or in a contract. For example, the increase in the CPI automatically determines whether the cost of living allowances, okay, the cost of living allowances in multi-year labor contracts. So they consider this and then only they decide about what should be the cost of living and then consequently the dearness allowances we are talking about. Okay. Now this is another important thing, real versus nominal interest rate. When we keep our money in bank, let's say bank is giving 7% interest rate. We keep our money in 2000 and now at the time of maturity 1 lakh rupee is, let's say, becoming 1,25,000. Now the question is, are we really better off by getting 1,25,000 in 2023? We don't know, because we need to adjust this money with the inflation rate. We need to calculate what is the inflation rate. If inflation rate is, let's say, 5%, then our gain is only 7 minus 5, 2%. If the inflation rate is more than interest rate, then there is no gain actually. So the nominal interest rate is the interest rate not corrected for inflation. So the rate of growth in the dollar value of a deposit or debt. So if we keep 1 rupee in bank, what is the bank giving? That is called the rate of interest. And real interest rate is actually corrected for inflation. So the rate of growth in the purchasing power of a deposit or debt. So how is it calculated? Very simple, nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate, as I said earlier. So suppose I have deposited $1,000 for 1 year, nominal interest rate is 9%, then during the year inflation is 3.5% and real interest rate should be 9 minus 3.5%. So it should be only 5.5%. So the purchasing power of $1,000 deposit has grown with not by 9% but by only 5.5%. This is the nominal interest rate, this is the real interest rate. So real interest rate will always be lower than nominal one because that is adjusted by inflation. So that means in summary, what we have learned, the consumer price index is a measure of the cost of living. How it is done? The CPI tracks the cost of typical consumer's basket, what we are buying in our day-to-day life, goods and services, housing, transportation, food and beverage, clothing, medicine, education, all these things. And CPI is used to make cost of living adjustment. Like as I said, that in our salary, government will give you some kind of allowance, which is called dearness allowances. Okay, after accounting for this cost of consumer price index. And then real interest rate is corrected for inflation, nominal is not. There are two measures of inflation. One is by CPI, another one is by GDP deflator. And we have also discussed about the relative merits and demerits of CPI and GDP deflator. With this, we are closing our discussion on cost of living. Thank you.